the overall feel of it.
So,
which part of the US are you from, Paula?
Well, I grew up in the Midwest, so I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, but I've lived in Oklahoma and DC, and I spent almost a decade, about 50% of my time in LA. And then I started teaching in the Central Appalachian Mountains of Virginia. And now that I'm back in the US, after spending 6 years in Qatar, I'm in Lexington, Kentucky. So this is where they breed all the racehorses.
Okay.
So it's a little university town, about 300,000 people, that's surrounded by horse farms. It's actually quite beautiful. And it's in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. So I can get into the mountains in about 2 hours or so. And I'm still close enough to the East Coast that if I want to go to the beach, I can.
Wonderful.
okay.
We are hoping to be in the US by the end of the month in Boston.
Oh, okay, nice. Yeah, well, the weather should be great by then.
Because her daughter is there and her grandchildren are there.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
grandmother is looking forward to
Yes.
meeting the grandchildren.
Right. So how long will you
Absolutely.
stay? How long will you stay?
For 6 weeks. We are hoping to be there for 6 weeks.
Nice. Yeah, that's nice.
It's not so nice. She's needed here to promote and develop mediation in India. I mean, that's
You are
She could
there
do
with
it
me.
she could do it online. She could
Yeah,
do it online.
As you said, today mediation is global.
absolutely.
we
That's
have
exactly what I'm
participants-
trying to put out. Yes, that's exactly
We
what.
have participants. I did a mediation recently. Participants from all over the world. I'm not all over, but from 5 countries.
Right.
See?
It's amazing.
Well, that's the one thing about the pandemic. It's been very disruptive in terms of how we communicate in a good way. And
Yes.
the idea that we can just get online and have these kind of conversations, it's just fabulous.
Yeah.
And when I was still in Qatar, they invited me to participate in a conference that was being held in Singapore. No, it was being held by an Indian university. And here they had people from Singapore, Malaysia, Qatar, India, and it was just so cool. I mean, you couldn't do it any other way. I mean, you could not create that experience any other way. And it was that all the students in the university who were interested were,
Yeah.
involved in the conversation. It was just so cool.
And
So-
even our practice, Paula and Vikram, we have enriched ourselves better with this facility. We can give options to our clients. You want physical, you want virtual. Some people say, we want virtual for now, and then
Right.
we transition. And others might say, we want physical for now, and then we transition to virtual. So it's really amazing. The tools in our hands have increased.
Right.
We can do so much better. So this is amazing. Paula, it's been wonderful meeting you. And Vikram, thanks for the opportunity. I wish you a great session.
Thank you, Leila.
Thank you
Always
so
a pleasure,
much.
like I said.
Nice.
Thank you.
And 19th, there's a workshop, Leila. Please participate in that. Just based on whatever we discussed here, looking at a model legislation kind of thing, we'll look at that. So please.
Mhm. Right.
So,
Well, I just want to say thank you for creating this event. I haven't been able to watch all the sessions, but I can go back and access those, right?
yep, absolutely.
I think
So-
that's really cool.
Okay.
I'm leaving.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Leila. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Thank
All
you,
right.
Paula. Thank you, Paula,
Bye.
for being part of the symposium. And
Yeah,
of course,
thank you for inviting me.
And of course, you have told us a little bit about yourself. So what I am going to do for a second, I need to put this out just to say, what are we doing here? This is mediation legislation, the how, what, when, where, which, who, why of it. in any order. This is just put out because it was put out alphabetically, but it can be a Y to start with or whatever. I mean, that's totally up to you. So you can take it where you want, but because of the fact that you don't really know about the various things I am doing, so what I'll do is, let me just put out for a second where you can find information. So basically, you go to mediatorvikram.com, and you'll find an idea of what's happening. Well, like, this is a new series that I started, which is Magic in Mediation, which is a book that Ken Cloak is coming out with in the fall.
Right. I saw your interview with him. He's one of my favorites too.
But whenever you people say interview, I don't like it. I say conversations. For me, it's always conversations.
Right.
So
well, definitely with him.
So basically, there's been lots that's happened, and now more than 550 videos there. But in terms of work, the focus is on developing the World Mediation Circle, which is a worldwide web of mediation circles. That web concept, Leila was the one who said web, call it the web. So that worldwide web of mediation circles. And of course, on the support part of it, on the events of every year, because there's so much that happens. I mean, this is the 8th symposium. So we've had 7 others, which of course have been on interesting topics, which, I mean, for me, there's a kind of a chain there. And the shows like Ken himself has been on so many shows. You can go there and see all these that he started with him with Evolution of a Mediator, and then various symposia he's been there. So there's lots available on this channel. And I call it the mediation channel if you have to. And who needs Netflix is what my byline is. So I mean, look, there are 600-700 hours of, maybe more, I don't know how many hours of content there. So even if you take out 1 hour a day, it takes you 2 years to see it. So there's so much. So Paula, it's you, about yourself, about mediation legislation. I come in if you want me to come in, and you can share the slides, please.
All right. Well, let me, we haven't, are we recording at this point?
Yeah, we went live right at the time when you were talking to Leila. Yeah.
Oh, all right. I didn't realize we were live.
You didn't get a message. You got a message there. Didn't you get a message saying that you're now live streamed? You must have pressed that, got it. Only then will it go.
I think when I first came in, I don't know. It doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me tell you how I've organized my presentation. So I have decided to kind of get back at 30,000 feet when it comes to Qatar and provide some context for what is very new legislation there, and situate it in a way that I think raises a lot of questions about why this is happening at this point, given the history of Qatar. And I've also provided some context in terms of what else is happening in the Arab Gulf region, because I think that informs the question about why is this happening now and what does it mean for the future. So that's really how I've got things organized. And so if you'd like, I can pull up my slides and start working through them.
Please.
Okay, so be patient with me because I have not worked with Zoom this way, obviously. I have a background as an educator, so I'm used to working with online screen share, but okay. Can you see that?
No, not yet. Or what you have to do is basically just open those slides somewhere on your screen and just press share screen and just select that window and just select. So have you opened the slide somewhere?
Hang on a minute. So I've got to get back to screen share. Oh, I see them.
Yeah, just click on that. And then...
Let's see, where are they? Why can't I find them?
Maybe out of all those windows, maybe somewhere there you'll find.
Well, you would think so, but I'm not seeing them. Sorry about this. Let's see if I have to go to files. Oh, here they are. They just took a while to load. Okay. So
yes.
Okay, now you've got them.
Yeah.
All right, they're loading now. Okay, so I'm going to focus, even though I'm living in the US now, I'm going to focus on things that are happening in Qatar. And I am really focused on 3 things, as I said, its role as a regional mediator, the new commercial mediation law, and then its future as a potential hub for mediation and other ADR processes.
But
So I want
to, Paula, you want to share the, you want to start the slideshow, because if
yeah, it should be. So did you see the second slide?
no, because if you, I think you'll have to start the slideshow.
You are, it says you are screen sharing.
Yeah, we see your slide, but the first one, that mediation in Qatar, that slide, not the second one.
Okay. I don't know why that would be, because it's showing up on my screen. I don't know what this thing is.
Basically, like I said, what you need to do is open the slides on your PowerPoint. It'll be open in front of your screen, then go to share screen, and just click that window, and then it'll keep changing them as you go along.
All right. I'm sorry about this. I was afraid that there would be some sort of
not an issue at all. That's not a problem at all.
Yeah, but I like to be more professional than this.
There's a one step before this. It's one step before that when the actual full slide was showing, and then it went back to
right. Okay. So
yeah.
I'm going to, your screen sharing is what it's saying now.
Yeah.
Can you see the slideshow?
Yeah. We can see the slideshow.
Okay. So I'm going to play from start.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So here's the first slide. Are you seeing the next slide now?
No. I think what happens is, why don't you just click on the slide? Maybe if you click on the second slide, maybe it'll move that way.
Let me see what's going on here. Okay.
Yeah, now the second slide. My background is there.
Okay, let me try this. Maybe I need to be using the buttons at the bottom here.
No, we can just move, I think, slide by slide. We won't start the slideshow, but I think starting the slideshow somewhere, I think, creates an issue. It seems.
Okay. Are you seeing the second slide now?
Yeah.
Okay. I think maybe I figured it out. Okay. So I want to give you a little bit about my background. So I practiced energy law and commercial litigation for 20 years in the US. And then I earned an LLM in dispute resolution from the University of Missouri School of Law, which was the top ranked program at the time. And then I began teaching law at this little mission-driven law school in the Central Appalachian Mountains that had been founded with a focus on ADR. And I designed its ADR certificate program. And I taught ADR for 13 years, including mediation and arbitration. And while I was in Virginia, I served as president of what was the largest group of mediation practitioners, scholars, and trainers in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And before that, I had been on their board and I planned conferences for them. And then I also served by appointment on the Virginia Supreme Court Committee that was charged with updating the training requirements, disciplinary rules, and ethics code for Virginia mediators. So very involved in kind of building structural support for high quality mediation in the state. And then I lived in Qatar from 2015 to 2021, where I taught skills courses at Qatar University College of Law. All right, so one of the things that I want to start with is the history of Qatar as a regional mediator. And I'm taking a lot of this conversation from two books. This is the first one.
We're not on that slide. So we're not on that slide. We only we're on the background side.
Okay, let me go back here and use the right buttons.
If you want, why don't you share the slide, the file here on the Zoom chat? Maybe I'll be able to open it here.
On the Zoom chat.
Yeah, if you just.
All right. So you're not seeing.
No.
Hang on. So we're back. Can you see my background slide?
Yeah.
Okay. History of regional mediator. You can't see it?
No.
I don't know what's going on with this thing. That's crazy. I'm using the right buttons, so. Okay. So,
yeah, now I can see the second one. Now the history as a regional mediator.
All right. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to click on the individual slide.
That'll be better. Yep.
And not have to worry about it.
Exactly.
Okay. So anyway, let me go back to this one. So I want to start with the history of Qatar as a regional mediator. And So for this conversation, I'm relying really on two books. This is the first one by Kamrava, and he is an academic, and he's been out at Education City and was working with one of the research centers out there. And I really like his work. And so this was one of his early books, and I read this before I moved to Qatar. So my expectations about mediation in Qatar were really elevated because of what I was reading in this book. So here's what he says. Rarely do small states involve themselves in international mediations as a principal mediator. In specific relation to the Middle East, the role of mediator has traditionally been played by regional heavyweights, in particular Egypt and Saudi Arabia, each of whom views itself as the protector of the regional status quo. For their part, none of the other GCC states have ever engaged in mediation efforts. Qatar's prolific mediation efforts are unique, both regionally and given its size globally. So one of the big questions is, why have they been so active in mediation type activities? So this is just some of the list of activities that I kind of quickly found. I can't say I've done any deep research on this, but one of the things I think you'll notice is, first of all, they did facilitate the Algerian independence from France in 1962, but then there's this big gap in their participation as a mediator in international political events. And so you're coming forward to May 2008. There's a lot of conversation about the role that they played in trying to calm a lot of instability in Lebanon. And they held talks in Doha for 5 days. So a lot of times they'll bring people in, they'll put them in expensive hotels, and they'll host the talks in Qatar. In 2008 to 2010, they were trying to facilitate negotiations between warring factions in Western Darfur in Sudan. In 2010, they tried to curtail the border dispute between Djibouti and Eritrea. In 2020, they were hosting the US Taliban withdrawal negotiations that eventually led to what was called the Doha Agreement. And then just in the last 5 or 6 days, they've stepped in to try and reduce tensions between Palestine and Israel. And then the other big aspect of their activity was negotiating hostage releases. And so there's this, surprisingly, I think, long list of different interventions that they did to successfully release hostages, primarily held in Syria or Afghanistan or Yemen or places that are, kind of near to them that are in high conflict at this point. So one of the questions that the other author that I've been working with raises is, what are the motives for playing this role? And he says that when mediation is part of government policy, then there are several motivations that may come up. So you may have a clear mandate to change the course of longstanding or escalating conflict and promote peace. You may have a desire to do something about conflict whose continuance may adversely affect a country's own political interests. You may be approached directly by one or both of the disputing parties to serve as a mediator. You may have the wish to preserve intact structure of which they are a part, and they may view mediation as a way of extending and enhancing their own influence and gaining some value from the conflict. So going back to Qatar's interventions, Robert suggests that Qatar had a significant investment in a lot of these places. They have a huge sovereign wealth fund, and they have made investments in a lot of places around the world. In 2007, before their participation in the Lebanese conversation, they were the 4th largest investor in Lebanon. They had large investments in Syria, which may partially explain their intervention in Syria in one way or the other. He also suggests often international actors are motivated by reciprocity. So Qatar is a country that imports 90% or more of its food from abroad, and Sudan is considered one of the breadbaskets of the world and does provide a lot of food sources for Qatar. In 2008, Qatar was not seen as having any strong ties to the Shia movement by the Lebanese stakeholders, and so it may have been viewed as a more honest broker. And at the same time, they had good relations with Israel, Iran, and the US, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. They certainly had a desire to calm regional tensions, particularly those involving Iran, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. And I saw this piece of information from 1948 to 2008. International actors had created 63 peacekeeping forces in the region. So after the end of the Cold War, there were a lot of these local disputes that flared that certainly threatened the security of surrounding countries, including Qatar. And one more factor that seems to play a role in terms of them getting invited into disputes, as they're seen as more independent of Saudi influence. They've had to balance relationships between Iran and Saudi Arabia, where they're geographically sandwiched between the two, and also kind of politically sandwiched. And then Kamrava suggested that this is a very intentional branding activity by Qatar to be seen as the regional mediator. So Roberts focuses on Qatar's resources, interests, and leadership. And I think that there is a lot of value in that point of view in terms of explaining this interest in mediation. And if you look at some of the older parts of Qatar, you'll see these sort of abandoned villages. And you can, the history is that until they discovered the petroleum resources there, it was a very difficult life on that little peninsula. It's, they were either doing subsistence farming, mostly livestock, or they were doing subsistence fishing, or they were doing pearl diving with trade in pearls. And so there was a period of time where they actually faced famine. So now you see this incredibly modern city with, deep resources. They just sponsored the World Cup, and they had this huge infrastructure build out associated with that, all the stadiums, all the highways, the subway system. And so they have this huge wealth, and the decision has been made that they're going to invest that wealth in a lot of different sort of peacemaking activities. Now, that wealth is largely derived from their petroleum resources, and as I said, they have a huge natural gas reserve. It's the third largest reserve in the world, and they developed their own LNG tanker fleet, so they are pretty much independent. I mean, this is like an independent operation that they have complete control over. And the complicating factor is that the gas field is shared with Iran. So if you look here, this is the Pars gas field, this is the Qatari piece of it, and this is the Iranian piece of it. And if you know anything about oil and gas production, you know that you manage those fields to try and get the maximum production out of the field. And so you have to cooperate in terms of where the placement of the wells and, production quotas and things like that. So they've had a long history of managing that field with Iran through whatever sort of political disputes have existed over time. And as a result of that huge wealth, the Qataris, which are only 20% of the population, have one of the highest per capita purchasing power in the world. So it's depending on the year and what's going on, the average Qatari, man, woman, and child, has anywhere from $90,000 to $120,000 worth of purchasing power. And it's a rentier economy, so the government subsidizes a lot of things for Qataris. utility bills, male weddings, children, education is free even at the university level for Qataris. So they've really made an investment in their people. And a big part of that was sponsored by this leader, Father Emir Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani. And he was really a modernizing leader, and he developed the petroleum resources. He distributed a lot of the wealth so that the regular Qataris were participating in a meaningful way. He dispersed power so that it wasn't just in the royal family. It was now more of a, a three-party or a three-branch system of government. Enfranchised women, and one of his wives is just a huge role model for the women there. She's very active in education and arts development, and she's just a real model for women there. Modernized the educational system, updated the Constitution, removed overt censorship, although there's still quite a bit in Qatar. Developed Qatar as a state seeking to bring peace through mediation, and really established Qatar as more of a neutral actor in the region, and engaged in a lot of checkbook diplomacy. So a big part of what's happening is because of him. And one of the things that's so interesting is that this sort of value is embedded in the Constitution. So Article 7 provides that the foreign policy of the state is based on the principle of strengthening international peace and security by means of encouraging peaceful resolution of international disputes, and shall support the right of peoples to self-determination, and shall not interfere in the domestic affairs of states, and shall cooperate with peace-loving nations. Now, to me, this is absolutely extraordinary. And you wonder, what was the source of this value? How did it get translated into this document? And I don't know the history of it, but I am pretty fascinated with it. I will say that the Constitution it's an aspirational document in many ways right now, and they don't have an active constitutional court that's interpreting any of its provisions at this point. But the fact that this exists, I think, is really quite interesting. So Father Emir voluntarily stepped down, and he made one of his sons the current leader of Qatar. And he is a very well respected, very well liked, one of the youngest leaders in the entire world. He was elevated to the position, I think, as the youngest leader in the world in his 30s. And he dealt with a very difficult period of time where he shepherded the country through the economic and sanctions that were imposed in June 2017 to January 2019 by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, who alleged that Qatar had financed international terrorism. The country responded with diplomacy, holding itself ready to negotiate an outcome, and avoided escalatory power-based strategies. So I've written extensively about this, and I've used a kind of a theoretical model that was developed at Harvard in the book called Getting Disputes Resolved. And the idea is that in functional dispute resolution systems, you try and resolve most disputes with interest-based processes. There may be times where you have to go to a rights-based process like litigation or arbitration, where you need a third-party decision. And then the last thing that you want to do is resort to power-based interventions. And so what really struck me was how consistently they were reinforcing the interest-based attempts at resolution. And they supply UAE with a very large volume of natural gas. They never cut off that supply. They continue to provide the natural gas. They did use rights-based processes at the UN in connection with human rights violations, WTO in connection with any trade-related issues. with international aviation bodies because there was an effort to try and make it very difficult to fly out of Doha, and with international shipping authorities because, of course, they're all on the Persian Gulf and they're using, they're using that shipping lane to get products in and out, not the least of which is petroleum products. And what struck me as I was watching this unfold, because I was living there at the time, was just how much dispute resolution capacity there was among its leaders. And the foreign minister was just masterful to watch him, get into different meetings with international actors to try and get Qatar's message across, and consistently reinforcing this message of, we want to negotiate, we think this needs to be negotiated. And it was really quite masterful. So I just wanted to point that out. That's kind of the most recent thing. The countries resolved the matter. The nature of the negotiations was very, very private. And it was triggered by the fact that Trump lost the election and Joe Biden was coming in. So in my opinion, that's what triggered it. All right. So if you're really interested in that topic, I've written 5 book chapters about it, and they're up somewhere. They may be up on Google Scholar, but I need to get them up on SSRN. All right. So the last thing I want to mention is their support for the Singapore Convention. So they were the 3rd country to ratify the Singapore Convention, and they did that officially in 2020. All right, so let me pause there and see if there's any questions at this point about any of that.
Look, Paula, my question has always been, how does a country mediate? Can a country be a mediator? That's what the issue for me is. It's an individual skill. How you do it, I can understand the ruler of Qatar being a good mediator. But when people say country is a mediator, I do have reservations as to how much understanding on the aspect of the skill requirement is there. What your thoughts on that are?
Well, obviously, they are implementing this public policy through individuals. So, whatever, if they're intervening in Palestine and Israel right now, they're doing it with particular individuals. And based on my experience, they can afford to have some of the best training in the world. My dean at the time that I was there had gotten his LLM in dispute resolution from Berkeley. And he was also on the negotiating team for Qatar during the sanction period, and was very active in the rights-based processes and appearances at The Hague. So it's delegated to individuals, but it's an exercise of foreign public policy.
No, what I'm saying, Paula, is that no, we need those names out. We need those people out. We need to say that this person in that country is the mediator in that particular situation. What happens is the people get lost, and it's all about a people's process. The person is the important part. It doesn't matter whatever the country, however the country looks at it. If that individual can perform and is actually a mediator, that's what needs to go out. I think those faces are not there in the world. Who are those mediators? That we shouldn't hide behind the country part of it. We should actually put those names out, those faces out. Why do I put Ken Cloak? I keep telling Ken, you are the face of I call it the dispute resolution revolution, the resolution revolution, because we need faces out there. The faces that don't exist, people, if today you say lawyer, a face will come out in front of you. If you say mediator, oh, what is that? I don't have a face. If you don't have a face, you don't take the process through. So even on the global level or on a local level, I think the situation remains the same. We don't have those faces out there to say globally, these people should be called in, and they don't have, it's not a country affiliation. These individuals bring that, and that's what we are trying to say at the local level also, that it's the person, and that person comes in with their own skill and everything. So those are my thoughts on this aspect.
That's a really interesting comment, because, Kamarava will say that typically those mediations are held very privately, and there aren't a lot of conversations until a deal's struck. That, you know, part of the process is to kind of, you know, the mediator is just a facilitator. They're not a star in the role. But surprisingly, Qatar is pretty public about the mediations that they're involved in. I don't really remember, those sort of public demonstrations, but I certainly knew who the foreign ministry was, and I certainly recognized him. I think he's now been elevated to basically Tamim's right-hand man. But I take your point, and in the sanctions situation, they enlisted an older sheikh out of Kuwait to be the mediator. And he did have a very public profile. And he went to the US and made an appearance with Trump and actually let leak that they had managed to avoid some sort of military intervention. But overall was not successful in bringing people to the table. And so, that was like, okay, this is interesting. And I kept thinking, what kind of training does he have? What is the skill set that he can bring other than, his status as this well-respected sheikh? And so I don't know. I take your point. I think Qatar may be better about that than other countries, but not to the extent that you seem to think is important. And so that's interesting. And, because of the constraints of confidentiality, as a mediator, you still couldn't even really talk about what happened. So I don't know.
Well, actually, we don't actually, I'm saying globally, we don't have faces to those people who should be there as mediators on global issues, because bringing in a country brings in a lot of other baggage with it. But individuals, I'm saying the same thing applies at a community level, it applies at the global level. These people whom you can trust can be brought in these situations, and we don't have that global pool of people in these large global conflicts available to the world at large. We need to, I need to put those faces out. I mean, that's what I will want to do, if we get to know who those people are.
Well, there were, as you talk about that, I'm thinking back to the people that were played a significant role in like the Irish peace talks. They had at least a pretty high profile in the US, but that's the only one I can really think of, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so imagine the entire world, so much history, and when we ask for, want to put faces out there for mediators, we don't have them. And then we want to promote this on a global level, and of course at the local level. These are examples that people need. Okay, in so and so situation, there was this person who did the mediation, and important things like you said, this Kuwaiti person came in, he had that respect in society or whatever. Nothing changes. It's a mirroring of what happens at a local level, at the global level, at the local. That's when mediation for me really gets popular or takes off, or I mean, those things happen when we can actually do this. Because if you don't put faces of mediators and we say countries mediate, the process also won't be understood. How do countries mediate? It's just
right. Right. Okay. Well, that sounds like a book to me.
Yeah, you should put that out, Paula.
Yeah, no. It'd be interesting, but no. Okay. So what I want to move on to is the Arab Gulf mediation laws. And in preparation for this discussion, I did a bunch of research, and I was actually kind of shocked. There is basically a sudden blossoming of mediation laws, and I keep asking why. Now, again, some context. So when I went to Qatar in 2015, having read these books about its international mediation role, I was kind of like, well, great, I'm going to get there. There's going to be all this conversation about mediation. There's going to be, all this structure for mediators, and there's going to be mediation groups, and I'm going to be able to teach mediation at QU. And I get there and find out, no, none of that's true. The country was very focused on arbitration, and they were using it in a lot of World Cup construction related disputes. There was some talk that the government was becoming more disinterested in arbitration because they felt like there might be an anti-government bias in arbitration. So that was kind of the conversation that I found myself in. And one of the things that I was thinking about was, if you haven't done a lot of training on interest-based negotiation, now, you know, there's all sorts of cultural values around negotiation in the Arab world. What exactly does that look like? I'm not quite sure. But, you know, one of the things that you have in the Arab world is the majlis. So this is physically a room that is in between the private house and the public space. And this is a place where men come, women typically are not involved. In fact, you know, it's separate because of the cultural limits on women being exposed to strangers. And so, you know, how does the majlis affect acceptance of mediation? If you're doing something that's problem solving in the majlis with people that you trust and like, and bring in a wise elder or whatever, do they see value in coming into a process with a third party mediator that is more distant when they don't necessarily know what the added value is? And I never got an answer to that. That's another thing that deserves attention. And it could still be a potential barrier to adoption of mediation more broadly in the Gulf in general. But at any rate, so one of the other things that I found so interesting is that this new blossoming started in Bahrain. And so they first had a royal decree in 2019 for commercial and civil disputes, essentially. And then they had a royal decree that was kind of fleshing that out with requirements and duties of mediators and the conduct of the mediation session. And then they had a decree about a year later on mediation of criminal cases, which I find extraordinary because I assume that they're using some sort of restorative justice in that process. And it's the only use of mediation in the criminal context in the Gulf, as far as I could tell. And then the Minister of Justice, Islamic Affairs, and Waqf issued regulations governing mediation of Sharia and family disputes. So again, they're on the leading edge of expanding the scope of mediation in the country. And so I've got a link there to some more information about that. All right, then UAE came next, and they passed Federal Law Number 6 of 2021. And again, it's focused on civil and commercial disputes. This I find interesting. UAE tends to have a heavier hand in the way that they do this. They had an arbitration law that imposed criminal penalties on arbitrators if they engaged in any, you know, a listed set of behaviors that were considered wrong. And there's that same flavor going on in terms of mediator misconduct. I haven't spent a lot of time analyzing that law yet, but it'll be fun to kind of compare it to the Qatari law eventually. And then Qatar came in very shortly after that with Law Number 20 of 2021. And again, that one's focused on civil and commercial disputes. Saudi Arabia is in the middle of drafting a law, and they are soliciting comments that'll close this summer in July. And I have 2 citations there if you want to see the links to the comment page and also an English language translation of the law. And one of the problems that I'm facing is a lot of these laws have not been translated into English. There's no official translation of the Qatari law. I have a translation, but it's not the official translation yet. So, that's a barrier. I'm working with a PhD student from Lebanon who's building a database of these laws, and we're hoping to get the laws up and any regulations that implement them and any codes of ethics that emerge, and try and get those translated from Arabic into English and French to make them more accessible. And then finally, Oman hasn't passed laws, but they developed rules of mediation for the Oman Commercial Arbitration Center. And again, that came out in 2021. So there's all this activity happening in 2021 after Bahrain kind of launched the process in 2019. So one of the big questions I have is, why are all these laws and rules coming out in the last few years? And, one theory I have is that these international companies are coming into this region. Many of them are already accustomed to ADR clauses that use mediation as one of the options, but there really wasn't any implementing legislation that allowed the courts to make referrals. And I think especially in the run-up to the World Cup, there were a lot of contracting companies that wanted to have one more option available to them. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is really that there's a lot of regional competition and nobody wants to feel kind of left behind. And so I think they're all vying for sort of status as the leader in the region for dispute resolution. One person that I talked with said that Saudi Arabia is putting a lot of money into trying to be the hub. But, whether that pans out or not, we'll just have to wait and see. All right, so now I just want to talk about ADR and the Qatari courts, unless you want to have any questions before I go on about this regional blossoming of ADR laws.
The interesting thing is that Saudi Arabia and Qatar have ratified the Singapore Convention. So, they're definitely regionally, they are looking at in some way coming out as that, okay, ease of doing business kind of a thing. It seems that way. But you are going to take us a little bit through the laws also as to how the structure has been created. You will do that?
A bit, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I will. Okay. So going on, I think you're right. I think once they sign the convention, it's like, well, gee, we've signed this convention, but we don't have anything in the state that allows us to really refer people to mediation or enforce mediation. Okay, so ADR in the Qatari courts. So the first place to start is the Qatar Financial Center, which was created in 2005, and almost all the Arab countries in the Gulf have what are these kind of bubbles. And international companies can come in and they can adhere to the rules. They become members of the center. There's probably some sort of fee. There's a tax that they pay. And what that does is it kind of creates a system that is more predictable, more familiar than if they were trying to comply with the laws in one of these Arab countries. And be subjected to local courts, including potentially Sharia law. So a lot of these countries have developed these financial centers. And the financial center, in addition to this sort of incorporation and regulatory piece, have got this dispute resolution piece. So they had the Qatar International Court, and this is really a system of private judging. And as you can see, this is a bit of an older picture, but you can see that there's really only one Qatari judge on the court, and almost all the judges are English, and there tends to be little diversity, which is a big concern for me and is an ongoing concern as Qatar gets deeper into this process. They also have a dispute resolution center that offers arbitration and mediation. And mediation is really a very recent development. They certainly held themselves out as offering mediation, but they hadn't really developed any rules and they hadn't filled out a roster. And right before I left, they were beginning to do that. And one of the concerns, again, I had was that the roster tended to be captured by older European lawyers. And again, no diversity in a country that's hugely diverse.
And also, Paula, in terms of gender?
Well, gender was the other. I mean, you can go down any list, you know, religion, language, nationality, gender, age, you know, pick a diverse piece, and it's an issue. So yeah. And, you know, if they're going to start, you know, one of the things they were talking about, I ran across somebody who said that there's a lot of concern about the divorce rate in Qatar. It's apparently approaching 50%. And my thoughts were, well, if they ever implement mediation in the family context, you're going to need a diverse panel, especially gender diverse, because you don't want mediators reinforcing cultural values that may actually be the reason that so many people are getting divorced. Because they're, you know, I had students that told me they had gotten married and they were getting a divorce, and I'd say, well, I'm sorry. And they're like, oh no, I'm fine, because they kind of satisfied a requirement and now they were, you know, regaining some independence, was kind of the story that I was getting. So I think that you have to be very mindful about how you develop these rosters, and I'm not sure it's going to happen. That's one of my concerns. All right, and then the court system, it's a three-tiered court. They have the civil courts, which are the trial level courts, a court of appeals, and the court of cassation. And the civil courts, I'm just talking about on the civil side. They have a lower court with jurisdictions of disputes that go up to about $27,000, and then a higher court that handles other civil disputes and disputes involving non-Qataris. So one of the first pieces of legislation that they passed was this law number 2 of 2017, promulgating the civil and commercial arbitration law. And this was a project that took about 2 years, extensive commenting, overall a pretty good law. I think that people really were very thoughtful about it. And I think the work product reflected a lot of experience and a lot of input from stakeholders. And so this, but yeah, again, look at the timeline. They've been doing the build out for the World Cup for years before they actually had this law in place. So, you know, how that worked before is a big question, but at least this was progress. And then the next thing that came out in 2021 is the new mediation law in settlement of civil and commercial disputes. And so the key provisions are, you have to have a mediation agreement. It can either be in the original contract, or it can be a separate contract that the parties enter after the dispute has arisen. The identity requirements and numbers of mediators, this is fairly sparse. And interestingly, you can see the hand of the arbitrators in this. You could either have 1 or 3 or multiples of 3 mediators. So somebody's confused about, you know, what mediators do and how many mediators you might want to have. Oh my gosh. Anyway, selection, termination, or replacement of the mediators. The role of the mediators, one of the more significant things here, it's not very well defined, as is mediation is not very well defined in the law. But they explicitly say that the mediator can make proposals or suggestions, but there's no guardrails that are set out in this law in terms of how that can be done. They do have confidentiality provisions, but again, there's some problems there in terms of what kind of disclosures are going to be made to the court in the settlement agreement. There's some ambiguity about what documents are going to be confidential. There's not this sort of distinction between pre-existing documents and documents created within the mediation. Requirements of the settlement agreement. So there's kind of a long list of disclosures that have to be in the settlement agreement. Termination of the process, liability of the mediators. So instead of kind of having a separate disciplinary system, they're trying to impose sanctions on the mediator for certain misconduct. Again, I think that's going to need some work. And then what's the role of the competent court in relation to the mediation proceedings? So can the court make referrals? Can the court pick a mediator? How does the court function in terms of enforcement of any settlement agreement? So that's the major outline. I view this as kind of basic implementing legislation. And from my perspective, I think it will need revision over time as people work with it, which is always kind of tricky because, you know, they're not that quick to do revisions. Personally, I think it needs to be supplemented with more specific rules, which will probably come out of the Ministry of Justice, would be my guess. Perhaps a mediator ethics code, restorative justice-based disciplinary process, as opposed to this, you know, sanction process that's conceived in the legislation itself. Certainly high quality training options. There's really no mention of training. That's kind of left to subsequent rules and regulations. The creation of a diverse roster of mediators, continuing mediation or mediator education requirements and opportunities, because, you know, I don't know, again, I don't know what the training requirements are going to be, but you want to continue to develop your mediation pool. And I would love to see an organization of mediators who can support high quality mediation in the country. So some of this perspective is based on my own research into what I call the infrastructure for high quality mediation, developed by a lot of states, primarily on the East Coast of the United States, including Virginia, which is where I practiced for a long time. And as I said, I was active in developing this sort of infrastructure, updating the infrastructure for Virginia mediators. So I'm not going to go into a deep description and analysis of the Qatari mediation law, because I am doing that right now in a series of blog posts at the Red Velvet Lawyer. And it's going to take me 2 or 3 weeks to finish that analysis, but I'm doing a pretty deep dive, and I'm trying to use different theoretical frameworks to analyze the statute with a specific focus on the core values of mediation, party self-determination, mediator neutrality, and confidentiality. So watch there if you want to get a lot more detail about the law. Something that I started doing was trying to link in with Arab lawyers and other professionals in the region and begin to have conversations about what was happening there and what they knew about the status of mediation in the region. And after having those conversations, I realized that there really needed to be some sort of place that these professionals could go for additional conversation and support. So I have created this Mediation for Professionals in the Arab World, and I want it to be inclusive in terms of, you know, it's for lawyers, it's for HR managers, it's for company managers, it's for judges potentially. I want it to be an inclusive group. But the goal is to post event notices, provide copies of laws, rules, regulations, and ethics codes, discuss mediation dilemmas, network and create community, and offer trainings over time. So I've already, this thing's 2 weeks old. Within the first week, I already had like 62 members or so. So, and you can see it's pretty active, the number of views.
Now you have 71 members. I'm the 71st member. I've just joined.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Only thing, Paula, what we have to do is we have to get Mary and Susanna in. Her time has started, their time. Mary,
Okay,
Susanna,
sorry.
please come in. Come in.
I'm sorry.
Now, the only thing is we actually needed someone who can speak Spanish and English. That is a bit of an issue Mary and Susanna always face. Come, Mary, please.
I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was running long. Hi, Suzanne. Hola.
Hello.
¿Cómo está? Anyway, I only had 2 more slides.
Yeah, if you
I
want
only
to.
had 2 more slides. One, who will be the regional hub for ADR? I don't know. And a thank you in a lot of languages to reflect the leadership that you've shown with this symposium.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Of course, lots of questions, but no time right now. Maybe on the 19th, maybe we'll get into more specifics of the laws. So thank you very much. And of course, please participate in other events. We'll have lots of things coming up. So thank you very much. You can
Thank
also
you.
do